Let me give you a theological question. Was it possible for Christ to give in to temptation and sin? Now, we all agree that He did not sin. We all agree that He never sinned once. He was perfect. Could He have sinned? Could He have sinned? How many think He could have sinned? How many think He could not have sinned? How many don't know? How many don't care? No, we should all care. Was it possible for Christ to give in to temptation and sin? If it was possible, that is called impeccability. That is called impeccability. Impeccability is spelled and I'll write this one down because we'll talk about it too. Impeccability, by definition, is that Christ could have given in and sinned, but He didn't. Now, we all agree He didn't sin. That's not the issue. Impeccability says that Christ was not able to sin, that He was not able to sin. Now, I believe in impeccability. I believe in the impeccability of Christ, that He was not able to sin. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says, He who knew no sin became sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in Him. It says in Hebrews 9, verse 14, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And there are other passages, 1 Peter 2:22, which says that there was no deceit found in Him. 1 John 3:5, which says that there was no sin in Him. Now that in and of itself cannot necessarily prove that He was impeccable, but I want to give you some thoughts. If He was unable to sin, essentially, how could He have been our high priest? How could He have been tempted like we are, yet without sin, if He couldn't sin? That's a great question, and that's a natural response to the impeccability, and I want to deal with that. Let me show you, I've got to move on here. Let me show you why I believe that He did not sin, could not sin. Man has one nature. It is a human nature. It is a sinful human nature. And so when things come into our lives, the tests and temptations, they may come at different degrees and different levels, but they'll come into our human nature, and there will be a appointed time at which, if it's too heavy, we will succumb. In other words, we will sin. For Christ, He had two natures. He had a human nature, and He had a divine nature. And so for Christ to have these situations come into His life, these tests come into His life, or temptations from Satan come into His life, they would come in and they would be much more intense, much more deep than we could ever go through. But they would hit a divine wall and stop. because of his divine nature. Because he can't sin as God. Now, let me throw this thought out to you. Heavy thought. Think about this. The absence of sin in no way violates or compromises human nature. Okay? So, if we didn't have a sin nature in us, if we were all perfect, we'd still be humans. We'd still be normal humans. We'd just do everything right. In other words, the absence of sin in no way compromises our human nature or violates our human nature. But the presence of sin definitely violates divine nature. The presence of sin definitely would violate the divine nature of Christ and the divine nature of God. And for us to say that Christ had a sin nature would be, as Brittany was implying, that God had a sin nature. Can you conceive of that? I can't. Now the question is then, as Amy asked, what about his temptations? What about him being the high priest? What about him suffering as we suffered? Well, he did suffer as we suffered. You can see the temptations went all the way to the wall of divine nature, and then they stopped. So his suffering was much greater than ours. But the question would be, were his temptations real? Were they genuine? And the answer is absolutely they were genuine, and here's why. Christ's temptation, get this, Christ's temptation was not to see if he would sin, but it was to prove he couldn't sin. That was the purpose of his temptations. Not to see if he would, but to prove that he can't. To prove that he was God in every way. Therefore, the temptations of Christ were definitely legitimate and real and proved that he was God. So it wasn't to see if he could, we all know he didn't, it was to prove that he couldn't, because he was God. So it was just another way of determining the deity of Jesus Christ, was to prove that he was God.